today is a major conference on what works in crime reduction, and it marks the end of a £3.2 million investment by the ESRC and the College of Policing to look at what works in crime reduction. And the work we've been doing over the last 3 years, 8 universities across the UK, was funded by the research councils and the colleges. And the idea basically was to clear the ground and get a really good picture of what works in crime reduction, including, really importantly, finding a way of translating all this academic stuff into something that practitioners could understand. And I think for me that's the most important thing that the project's delivered.
We knew there was a huge amount of work to do to get all of the crime reduction evidence out there, all in one place, labelled up. And we didn't really know what was out there, and we certainly didn't have an easy way of communicating that to police officers and staff and other people out there interested in crime reduction evidence. So all of this work has been done to bring the crime reduction evidence base together and to package it up behind a clear, sort of accessible front page. People can then go through, find out more. It's a way of attracting them into the evidence base. What's been great for us, I think, is that we've had this really good partnership. We've worked on the front end, kind of trying to attract officers and staff and other people in, and the academics have worked behind the scenes to do an amazing amount of work on understanding really what the evidence base is telling us, and being careful and rigorous about what we can say on the basis of that evidence, and that has really worked brilliantly for us. That's been the perfect partnership essentially.
One of the main outcomes of the project has been the ME acronym. This identifies 5 types of evidence that we think crime prevention decision makers need to consider.
One relates to the effects of an intervention, another relates to the mechanisms through which that intervention produces the effect. A third relates to the context or moderator, which refers to the circumstances in which the intervention will activate the mechanism to produce an effect. The fourth relates to implementation. It turns out to be quite difficult to put some measures in place, and so decision makers need to know what's involved in putting them in place successfully. And the fifth relates to economy. There are always finite resources, and decision makers need to know how best to disperse their resources. And to do that, there needs to be some decent economic analysis.
So the purpose of the first work package was to systematically assemble the evidence base in crime reduction. So that meant that we had to systematically search all of the literature in the English-speaking world to assemble the evidence syntheses that had had a measurable crime outcome. So the work from this work package fed into our fourth work package, which was to appraise the evidence and to rank it so that it could be packaged up onto the What Works in Crime Reduction Toolkit, so available for practitioners. We had a lot of collaboration with practitioners. We worked widely with the College of Policing, and it's the first time that such an ambitious task has been brought to fruition. So it's gathered a lot of interest from both researchers across the world, but also practitioner groups.
On the What Works project, I had several roles, one of which was looking at the costing of interventions. What our research showed was that most evaluations and systematic reviews of those evaluations don't really include the costs of those interventions. So we reviewed different methods of estimating the costs of interventions, tried to explain that in ways which would be useful for practitioners so they could really understand how much an intervention costs to implement in their setting.
So the part of the What Works crime reduction programme that we were involved in was the design and delivery of a programme to use the online toolkit. So this was to basically teach police officers how to use the information that was put onto the online toolkit about what works for particular interventions. So basically we designed a programme that had 3 key elements. One was to get them to think about the toolkit and the value of kind of evidence-based approaches. The second element was to actually apply that toolkit to a particular problem. So we gave them a scenario based around alcohol and violence in a local neighbourhood. And then the third element was to get them to review their use of the toolkit and to think about how they could work collaboratively with universities to undertake evaluation of initiatives.
My part was the lead systematic reviewer for the topic of domestic violence. What we found was a lot of research had already been done on perpetrator programs but didn't really find a result, and there were lots of reasons for this. One of the reasons we think is that people who go on perpetrator programs can be court ordered to go, or they could be voluntary, and we think that's an important difference. So we just looked at those men who were court ordered to attend a program and see what could be done to increase their motivation to change.
Our review looked at alligating, a situational crime prevention scheme. As the name implies, its gates are erected at either end of an alley, the keys of which are given to those households that border an alley. What we found is that overall the evidence suggests that alligating is an effective crime prevention measure. It works best under certain conditions, in particular when you have resident support and commitment. There were lots of challenges associated with putting alligates in place that's important to consider if you're going to roll with an alligating scheme.
So the project I think that we were most heavily involved in is the Crime Reduction Toolkit. So this is taking all of the existing evidence on what works to reduce crime and making it easily accessible for frontline practitioners and other decision makers to use the evidence to make choices about what they invest in or what tactics they might want to try to reduce problems that they're experiencing in their areas. I think one of the things that we've discovered through doing the toolkit is that there's actually a lot of evidence around how you can manage people who have already started to offending, so how you can divert them from offending. Where we haven't got as much evidence is the real kind of upstream prevention. So how do you stop people from offending in the first place, and how do you stop crime from happening in the first place? And I think that's a real gap in our evidence base that we want to try and fill over the forthcoming years.
So the main finding of the crime prevention communication studies that we conducted, what we were interested really was trying to move beyond just scaring people into changing their behaviour. So if you think about a lot of crime prevention campaigns, they rely on creating fear, on the understanding that people will change what they do and protect themselves more. We found that there's another way of doing this where you don't have to scare people, and that's by using humour, using emotion and changing who the messenger is. And what we've found from the research is that by recalibrating your messages in this kind of way, you can have similar levels of effectiveness to more traditional crime prevention campaigns, but without inducing fear in the public.
Well, the project I was involved in, we looked at a review of DASH, and DASH is the Domestic Abuse, Stalking and Honor-Based Violence Risk Checklist. It's a checklist used by frontline officers, specialist officers and partner agencies in the community. It's a 27-item checklist which is meant to assess the risk that victims face of future violence and abuse. It's been implemented since 2009 nationally, but it hadn't been yet subjected to a rigorous national piece of research looking at how it's used in the field. So what we wanted to do is rectify that gap in the evidence.
We've just finished the final panel session where I was one of the speakers. I was pleased to see the majority of attendees stayed for the duration, which is usually a pretty good sign of how well a conference is going. No shortage of questions from the floor, and indeed we ran out of time and people seem to be really engaged. And I think what's really important about today is we brought together practitioners from the police alongside policymakers, academics, funders and others in the same space. So certainly from what I've heard this afternoon, everyone seems really sort of energised and hopefully going away with lots of exciting ideas.